Welcome back to a brand new edition of the Mixed Martial Arts Beat right here on MMAfighting.com. Hello again, everyone. I'm Ariel Helwani. Amazingly, it has been over a month since we've done one of these, so that means there is a whole lot to talk about in the world of mixed martial arts. Let us waste no time. Let's get right into it. Joining us today in studio, Mike Straka of SiriusXM Tap Out Radio and Fight Now TV. Hello, Mike.
Hello, Ariel.
How are you?
I'm excellent.
Good to have you back.
Thank you, sir.
Of MMAfighting.com and Spike TV's MMA Uncensored Live, he is, of course, Luke Thomas.
Hi,
Hello,
Ariel.
Luke. How are you?
Good, how are you?
And, of course, the man with the famous hat, Chuck Mindenhall of ESPN.com and ESPN the Magazine. So good to have you back, Chuck.
What's up?
All right, guys, let's get right into it. As I mentioned, it has been over a month since we've last done a show here. And the big story of the month of November, I think, was GSP's return and then all the talk after his return about the potential super fight against Anderson Silva. It seems like every day we get another story out there from either GSP's camp, Anderson Silva's camp, about, will this fight happen? Will it not? We're sitting here December 1st. I'll go to you first, Luke. Will GSP's next fight be against Anderson Silva?
I have my doubts. I certainly have no inside track. Maybe the other journalists here do. The UFC clearly does not know if it's going to happen either. We were talking off camera about some things that they did, putting Anderson Silva on camera, not really having a plan in place for a definitive one, talking about it in the press. But clearly what all these things amount to are soft and or hard pressure on GSP to succumb. And I'm in a position where I agree that there is a way to look at the GSP Silva fight and be angry about it. You can say there are these contenders at welterweight and this is the right path. And what about a Nick Diaz fight? And I think those are all very fair arguments. Personally, I'm in favor of the fight. I think it's a fight where it's greater than the sum of its parts. But it's an interesting clash between a fight that can do so much for the sport and athletes exercising, now at the top of the food chain, but athletes exercising what little contractual leverage they have to manage their own futures. And if Georges St-Pierre doesn't feel like he wants it, and by the way, he's been consistent from 2008 all the way to 2012 in various different iterations about basically saying he doesn't want to do it. And the fact that he lives at welterweight, which is this talent-rich division, constantly forcing contenders at the top, he has a legitimate way to say, this is where I would like to do my work. I have no idea what the future holds.
Chuck, do you believe GSP truly doesn't want to fight Anderson Silva, or is he maybe just negotiating through the media?
It's probably a little bit of both. I mean, honestly, when you take a look at it, he's said he's willing to fight any guy at 170 pounds. If Anderson Silva could find a way to get down to 170 pounds, I doubt he'd have any gripes about it, particularly with the payday that would bring. His thing is fluctuating weight. Even at a catch weight, he's been guarded against, as Luke said, for a long time. He doesn't want to do what Roy Jones did. He actually cited Roy Jones kind of messing with a good thing. So I think that for GSP's standpoint, anybody at 170, you have that fresh crop of contenders, obviously, like we're mentioning, Johnny Hendricks, and I think truly what he really wants is Nick Diaz, because that will motivate him to get into that fight. I think that's the motivating factor ahead of Anderson Silva and all the money, is he would like to fight Nick Diaz at 170 pounds. So there's a lot of factors there, but I believe that he would prefer to stay at 170 regardless.
Mike, now that the UFC flew Anderson Silva out to UFC 154, they put him on the screen there for the entire fight.
He did a pre-fight press conference.
All that stuff. And Dana White said, essentially after the fight, I'm making this fight. Does he have to make it at this point? For his own sort of reputation, for building
Dana?
Dana, does he have to do whatever he can to make this fight?
Yes, he does. Or Anderson versus John Jones. One of those two fights has to happen. But I was told by somebody very close to George that George today makes close to $8 million a fight. So to fight Anderson Silva, he's going to ask for $50 million.
5-0?
5-0.
Wow.
Because he said that George has 10 fights left in his career at $8 million a fight. But he believes that Anderson could actually hurt him, could physically hurt him and end his career. So to take that chance, he wants $50 million, and that's exactly the number that he's going to go to Dana White with.
And on Quebec television on Sunday night, the host said that he makes $15 million a year outside of his UFC purses. So he's making, approximately $25 or so million a year. I guess he doesn't. Well, based on Mike's sources here.
I'm sure that's correct, but I don't believe.
You don't believe the $15 million?
No, I don't think that's.
He didn't disagree.
Yeah, of course he doesn't, because he wants to leverage himself to be making more than he is. But he does not make. This is not Peyton Manning. Sorry, he does not make that kind of money. No.
Point being, does he have more to lose here?
But he still might make $5 million a year, which is more than any other fighter.
Sure.
But the point is, obviously, if he beats Anderson Silva, it's a major feather in his cap. but does he have more to lose here? Because everything's going so well, he looked good in his return. For GSP, is the risk greater than the reward?
Of course it is.
The risk is greater than the reward. The interesting portion is that if most of the onus of the weight change is on Silva, but Silva has 2 fights left in his contract. He's 38. He can really, he doesn't even see himself as this guy who needs to fight contenders anymore.
Wait, and you were there at that press conference where Anderson Silva said, I have 2 fights left. I want to fight George, and then I want to fight Jon Jones.
Yeah.
Right.
He said it.
But that dovetails with what the UFC wants. The UFC wants to have a big 2013. I mean, they want to have a big every year, but they really want to have a rebound after figuring things out with Fox, getting their ducks in a row, and having these super fights. But for St-Pierre, the value add of taking on this additional risk is sort of unnecessary.
Yep.
As Straka mentioned, he makes good money fighting Nick Diaz and Johnny Hendricks and whoever else. These are more manageable tasks. It's only this glory-chasing vanity project that Silva wants. Now, again, I'm in favor of it. I hope it happens.
I don't even know if Silva wants it. It's more UFC wants it. It's great for the
I think it's
sport.
fair to say Silva wants it.
Do you think,
think
though,
so.
that the timing is a little suspect? Because Silva only really started to ask for this fight once everyone was asking for Jon Jones versus Anderson Silva. Is this his way of dodging that fight?
Perhaps.
Well, I think that's definitely part of it. When you take a look at Anderson Silva's alternatives, which would be Chris Weidman, who had made his case for a fight, and then Jon Jones, neither one of those alternatives is going to present itself better than GSP. And I remember talking to George Guimaraes back a long time, Anderson Silva's manager, and they actually brought up a GSP catchweight fight quite a while ago, and it was really right around that time when people started talking about Jones and Silva and things like that. So the bottom line is, I think, yes, that for Silva, the GSP fight looks way more attractive. It still makes the same amount of money, and it plays closer to his contract. It just makes a lot of sense for him.
Where would they do that fight, though?
I was just about to ask you that question, Mike. That's unbelievable.
Brazil.
I feel like well, Dana White has
or
talked
Canada.
about Dana White has talked about Brazil Soccer Stadium. He's talked about the Rogers Center, or they want to fight at Cowboy Stadium. Can they fill Cowboy Stadium?
No, of course not.
The only neutral one of that bunch.
Is Dallas an MMA market?
Right.
It is not. It is not an MMA market. Why would they ever do that? Like,
Pacquiao couldn't fill.
I mean,
Dallas
come on,
Cowboys.
really?
Not against Claudia, not against Margarito.
I feel like that's
I think
where they want the fight to
they
happen.
need to do it. They should do it in Brazil, or they should do it at the Rogers Center, and that's it.
Can Anderson Silva and Jon Jones fill that? I mean, like that's
Right.
the whole thing.
Are they big
They
enough
should not
names?
do it. I agree that Canada's okay. I don't like Brazil for the sole reason that that's a fight where they're looking to make the. I mean, they're doing this all the time, but to make the most of the pay-per-view, you put a fight in Brazil, you downturn that because you don't get the same kind of media response you need for your pay-per-view purchasing audience. You do it in the U.S. or Canada only.
Now, what about the Jon Jones fight? Do you think that would work in Texas Stadium, or do you think no fight right now in UFC is
fight.
big enough?
I honestly think no fight would. I mean, Jon Jones is not to that superstar transcendent level. So stacking him against Anderson Silva right now, no, I don't think it to do it either.
You agree?
I agree 100%.
Now, what about, let's just say it doesn't happen, right? For whatever reason, GSP gets his way. Who should he fight next,
Johnny Hendricks.
you think? Despite the fact that
Because Johnny Hendricks is the #1 contender.
the biggest money fight, though, is Nick Diaz.
Of course it is.
By far.
But so is
I would go-
So is Anderson Silva. That's a big money fight too.
Is it crazy to say that Nick Diaz versus GSP is bigger as far as a money fight than GSP Anderson?
Well, that could be.
No, it's not a bigger money fight.
You don't think?
It could
No, no.
Think about the lead up, the build up.
Yeah.
What will happen between them two?
No.
And then compare it to what will happen between GSP and Anderson.
You know what? GSP and Anderson will be very respectful. Nobody will talk trash.
It won't be like that with Nick.
will come right out. Where you at, George?
I agree. They'll have the build-up will have different complexions, but we're talking about the meeting of two people with vastly greater star power when it's GSP Anderson than it is when it's GSP Diaz. GSP Diaz will do well. I'm talking like 800,000 pay-per-view buys, maybe even 1 million. But I don't think it has enough stuff, so to speak, to put it over the edge like GSP Anderson.
Should they do the Nick Diaz first? If they can't get the Anderson
I mean,
fight?
listen, they're doing Sonnen versus Jones.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, why not, I suppose. But, I think I agree with Straka. I mean, Johnny Hendricks earned his place. It's so hard to get a welterweight title shot. You look at that #1 contender match between Hendricks and Kampmann. Kampmann barely got by Alves. He barely got by Ellenberger, and obviously he had done well in one of his other fights. But then he gets starched by Johnny Hendricks. Johnny Hendricks barely got by
He beat Jake
Costa.
Shields, though. He did beat Jake Shields.
He did, but that's another point. Like,
Terrible
that's
decision.
my point. Like, he beat Jake Shields and got robbed by the judges. You have to win so many fights against so many good guys. I understand why Hendricks wants to sit and believes he deserves the
He
title.
deserves it. He does deserve it.
What do you think, Chuck?
Yeah, I agree with it 100%. Obviously, like you said, the money fight's going to be Diaz, and I think GSP's druthers would go towards Diaz, and we'll see how much how much influence he'll have on the situation. But I can guarantee you that that's the fight he wants. And when you think of a guy like Johnny Hendricks, the reason hardcore fans and some casual fans maybe would see him as a legit matchup is because it's interesting to contemplate a good wrestler like that, heavy hands, very heady fighter going against GSP presents a lot of challenges that we haven't seen GSP and one guy we haven't seen GSP face. So I'd like to see that fight next if it's going to be at 170 and it's going to be just against one of those two guys.
But it's a nightmare if Johnny wins. It's a nightmare for the UFC because Johnny does not draw the same numbers as GSP.
Dana White doesn't root for anybody.
Nick
we know
Diaz,
that.
if Nick Diaz beats George, it's still a pretty good champion. But if Johnny wins, it's like Frankie Edgar at 155. Like, Frankie's a great fighter, but he didn't draw.
Right.
So if Johnny wins, it's a nightmare for UFC.
On this show, a few weeks back, maybe even months, we were talking about Overeem and Diaz. We thought Overeem was getting a title shot upon his return. That's not happening. I'm very curious to see what they do with Nick Diaz upon his return, because it's going to happen at some point. It's December. He's free to fight come February. They should be booking this fight sometime now. I'm kind of looking at that Anaheim show as a potential return for him. He's from California. For me, there's only two options. The Condit rematch, and I'm not sure he'll be ready, or if he wins on December 8th, Rory MacDonald. To me, if you book him against anyone else, Koscheck, not interested. Anyone else at 170 not interested. Do those names interest you guys? Mike, we'll start with you.
Absolutely. If
which one most?
Rory wins, which is a big if, because if you believe what BJ said on the conference call, I loved what he had to say on the conference call. I've never heard him that animated ever.
We will get to that in a moment.
Love that. But honestly, I think Rory wins that fight, even though in my heart I want BJ to win, because I'm an old school guy and I want BJ to win, but I just don't see him having any answer for Rory. But if Rory wins, I would love to see Nick Diaz fight him. I would love that.
I think any of those names are good. I wouldn't mind seeing an Ellenberger fight. The only name I don't want to see in there is the Koscheck fight. You mentioned that.
Why?
Koscheck is incredibly talented. I like him. I like what he brings to the game. I think he's an important component to the UFC puzzle, so to speak. It is promotional malpractice to put him against a guy who could be a contender for a huge fight. No one wants to see Josh Koscheck fight for another title, probably, as long as St-Pierre's a champion, which will probably be the case for a while.
I don't know about that.
No one wants to see him. They don't believe in the chance
know
that
about
he has.
He got 2 shots already. Yeah.
First of all, there are two
one shot.
people.
Shots at GSP.
There are two people at 170 that can beat George. Johnny Hendricks and Damian Maia.
Damian Maia, really?
Yeah, but here's the point about Koscheck. I think it's fair to say most people don't want to see him at it. And if you put a contender, I'm not saying Diaz automatically loses to Koscheck. Obviously he can win, but the point is if you put him in that for a guy who's basically got no title in future, that is, you're killing off a contender for no good reason, especially one that could, when he fights GSP, as everyone agrees, would be a big money fight.
Rory MacDonald against, Rory MacDonald and Diaz would be a great fight. I know Rory MacDonald would love it. It's just he's already beaten up Nathan, so it'd be one of those things like he gets to fight the other brother. I think that would be a great fight.
I am so glad you brought up Rory MacDonald, because I find him to be one of, if not the most fascinating stories in MMA right now. His demeanor blows me away. His I don't give an F. He sits there at the Q&A like we're all bothering him being here, but he just tells you what's on his mind. There's no filter. He's young. He comes across that way, but his transformation, his style, the way he's handling himself right now, I truly believe, and I know they probably don't like me continuing to say this, I truly believe that if given the opportunity, he will fight GSP. I don't think GSP wants to fight him, but I think Rory MacDonald is a killer now, and he has this map planned out.
I spent a day with him in Montreal for Fight Magazine, a piece I was doing, and if there's a more dedicated, more focused guy in the gym, I don't know who he is. He just wanted nothing to do with media. Whatever his media obligations were, he wanted nothing to do with them because it was going to infringe on his training time and everything else. And then you get into a very serious conversation about GSP, the potential of that. There is a gray area there. It's there because he's a competitor, and he is that kind of competitor. He wants to be the greatest, not just in one division, but in possibly 2 divisions. He'll tell you straight up that that's what he wants to do. One of those roads has to go through GSP at some point, you would think.
But what happens if GSP actually does take the Anderson Silva fight and wins? Does he go to 185? Does he vacate 170 and let Rory have his way in the division?
A lot of ifs there. I mean, there's a lot of things that need to happen.
I think Rory goes to middleweight sooner than people think. If you look at Jones, he can make that cut to 205 pretty easily, even though he's a monster, right? I mean, not easily, but all things being equal, I've seen harder cuts. That cut for Rory is tough. You see him on fight week, he looks like death. I mean, it's not James Irvin on the scale.
He looks like somebody out of Twilight, like a vampire.
He has a hard time with that cut, man. He's only 23 years old. He's going to get bigger. The GSP thing may or may not happen in my view, only because, not because he's not good enough, but because I think sooner or later you're going to see him in middleweight. He just can't keep going to 170 like this.
You were on the conference call, though, the UFC on Fox 5 conference call, and I just find every time you ask him about GSP, he always has this sort of, I don't really care. Did you talk to GSP about fighting BJ? GSP beat him twice. No, not really. Will GSP be there? Okay, fine, he's not going to be there. But he was when GSP was getting ready for his fight, they asked him, did you train with Rory? No, not really. It just seems weird. They're both there. They're in the same weight class. They don't help each other out.
It's almost like when Carlos said, we train together, but I'm on this side of the gym and he's on that side of the gym. So I think Rory and George are probably like the same way.
Final thing about George, then we'll move on. Just want to get your take on.
He's very handsome.
He is very handsome. And perhaps he's a lightning rod. When he says something, people react. Fight week UFC 154, accent. He talked, and good point as well. He talked about women's MMA. He said it's not his thing. He didn't put them down. He didn't say the women don't deserve to be in the UFC. They don't deserve to be in the cage. I just don't like watching it. Miesha Tate, Ronda Rousey, other fighters, women fighters, female fighters, fans, etc., blasted him, called him sexist, prejudiced, all this stuff. To me, my takeaway from that was, A, it's his opinion. He didn't say that they don't belong. He said he didn't like watching it the same way I don't enjoy watching
baseball.
LPGA.
He's not the first fighter to say this. It's just he might be the first fighter of his caliber maybe to go on record and say something like that. I've talked to plenty of fighters who've, echoed that same sentiment. They have no interest in watching women's MMA. That doesn't mean that they, that they think less of women or something like that. It just means that they don't want to watch it.
And it almost upset me because, as you know, Luke, GSP is not the most forthcoming guy with his thoughts, right? Very guarded. He finally says something somewhat interesting. I mean, you know what I mean? And everyone rips on him. Great. Now he's never going to say anything. It's not worth it anymore. And he didn't even say anything all that bad. I mean, it's his prerogative. Different strokes, different folks. And at the end of the day, I think what he was trying to say, really, I think he was almost being chivalrous. I think he was almost saying, I don't like seeing women get punched in the face.
Well.
But he wasn't saying they don't belong.
No, I mean, although to say I don't like seeing women get punched in the face, personally speaking, just personally, I think that's patronizing. But you have to admit, there's a huge portion of the fan base of rational people, well-adjusted in society, who simply don't like to see women's fights. I'd rather die than sit courtside at a WNBA game. I'd rather find $5 in my
people, well-adjusted to society.
Does that make you prejudiced? Does that make you sexist?
No, it's because the to me, personally speaking, the drop off in the game relative to the men's side is so huge. I don't get a lot out of it, but that doesn't work for tennis. That doesn't work for a lot of other women's sports.
And let's be clear, that's not what he was saying, right?
No,
he didn't say they weren't good enough. He was saying he doesn't like seeing them get punched in the face. So is that wrong?
I don't agree, but no. I mean, it's sort of like, I don't like red wine. Well, you have the palate of a toddler, but that's your choice to say these are things that I don't like. And again, I think when you brought up the critical distinction, he didn't call for the outlawing of it. He didn't call for, Ronda Rousey has no business in the UFC. He didn't say any of that. He just said, personally speaking, it's not something I enjoy. And that's the end of it.
Not at all.
There's plenty of people in the media who...
First of all, the last thing on my mind was what George thinks of women's MMA. I don't give a shit what George thinks of women's MMA. I really don't.
He is a very influential figure in the sport. So
is he really?
Georges St-Pierre?
He's been out for 14 months.
He's the pay-per-view king.
I agree with you, though. That people are just trying to pry him open, You hear this all the time. We can't get anything for Georges St-Pierre. He finally says something that's even semi-controversial, and it blows up in his face.
So he won't ever say anything again.
Right. Georges St-Pierre is very influential. So when he says this on essentially the eve of women making their debut in the UFC, I can understand why they were fired up about it, but let's be real. You can't force, same way you can't force everyone to love MMA, you can't force everyone to love women's MMA, and guess what? With the women debuting in the Octagon next year, this is coming times 10. They better get used to it. It's going to happen a lot more.
I don't want to see Ronda versus Miesha again. I want to see Ronda versus Cyborg.
Yeah, here's the thing though, it's never gonna go away either.
Right.
Like, it's not just when she comes over. When her career is over, there will still be a significant portion of the fan base that's just like, I'm not into it. I'm just not into it.
All right, guys, let's move on because in exactly a week, in my opinion, the best UFC main card of the year will take place in Seattle, Key Arena, UFC on Fox 5, and in my opinion, the most intriguing fight on the card. No disrespect to Benson Henderson and Nate Diaz, no disrespect to Alexander Gustafsson and Shogun Rua, BJ Penn versus Rory MacDonald. In many ways, I obviously mentioned why I'm so interested in Rory, but BJ Penn, as of late, conference call, the videos he's putting out, the kind of shape he's in, I think we get into this a lot, we fall for this a lot. BJ sells himself very well, but I'm actually buying it. When this fight was first announced, Luke, I thought, this is a crazy fight for BJ. Why is he going up against Rory MacDonald, the guy who could probably fight at 185, killer young guy? Now he's actually making me think like, BJ Penn is motivated and he's going to go out there and shock the world next weekend.
I'm like you. I'm a sucker for BJ Penn. You know, he'll say, "I'm back," and yes, I believe it. Yeah. He could be in line at McDonald's, and I believe it. You know, and what's kind of crazy about BJ is, someone was asking me like, "Is he an all-time great?" And my initial instinct was to say yes. You know, first a non-Brazilian to win the Jiu-Jitsu World Championships, a guy who won a belt in 2 different weight classes, and you know, and did it with this aplomb that you just don't see. And then I looked at his record, and it's like, there's just a lack of consistency there. And partly, and in fact, almost entirely, but not entirely, due to just jumping weight, fighting at the Gracies at 185, and I mean, this weird sort of thing. And so I think he's not quite at that all-time, you know, he's not the Anderson Silva GSP level just for that reason. But you know what's so crazy about BJ is you get suckered in because you know there's something there. You know, the guy put out a video, 15 seconds?
I loved it.
Shirtless, shadow boxing in his yard, and everyone's like, I'm sold, that's it.
Thanksgiving, whenever
you know, no one else can do that. No one else in the game can put out a video of 15 seconds of shadow boxing shirtless in his yard.
And it has like 100-something thousand views.
I frankly think that I still like Rory MacDonald to win the fight, just my rational brain. But it is telling about BJ. Maybe he is an all-time, you know, great. Maybe he is. It's a matter of debate.
I think he is.
But just because he has that kind of pull over people tells you just how talent-rich he is, even if his career fell short at times.
It's funny, like when you take a look at like records in terms of, you know, it's a nascent sport. This has only been a sport. It's been professional essentially for 20 years in that range, and Zuffa coming in a decade into that. And you look at who BJ Penn has fought. It's not like he's fought middle guys. He hasn't padded his record. Like as you're kind of mentioning, he has had a lot of losses, but he's always fighting monsters. You know, the Matt Hughes is the GSPs, Frank Yeager twice. I mean, guys, Fitch, Diaz, on, and now he's calling out Rory MacDonald. He has always faced the best competition, and you know, he's 5-5-1 in title fights against some of the best guys in the world. I mean, is that great? No, it's not great. So that would look mediocre. But given the guys that he's fought and he's beat and he's lost to in our still young sport, I'd still consider him one of the greatest.
Well, think about how good he looked at UFC 101 against Kenny Florian. I mean, Kenny Florian was like, you know, BJ, I respect you, but it's time to beat the master, kill the master. Right. And I believed Kenny Florian. I really did. I went to Philadelphia and I said, Kenny Florian's going to be the new champion. And BJ just manhandled him and then choked him out. And, you know, this could be the guy who shows up next week. It could be the same guy.
At lightweight, though, not 170.
Exactly, that's the thing that's always bothered me about BJ. I think at 155, still today, he's one of the best in the world. Especially with...
And the biggest pay-per-view draw.
And Frankie Edgar isn't the champion anymore. There's a lot of fresh matchups for him. I'd love to see him against Benson Henderson. I just wish he would stay at 155. But I got to admit, at 170, he looks probably the best he's ever looked, including when he was champion right now. And
you know how hard it is to cut weight, though? How old is he, 34?
He'll be 34 2 weeks after the fight.
Here's an interesting thing.
It's so hard to cut weight at that age.
I worked on the first UFC primetime. This was between when I left, when MMA Rated closed down and when I got back in the game with Versus.com and AOL Fan House. And my job was to watch BJ Penn's training camp footage. I had to watch all of it, screen it,
carrying
log
the rock underwater.
All that stuff.
Yeah.
That was me. And
that was the best one ever.
Well, I appreciate that. It was very surprising watching his training. And you know, he was called out by Dana White.
It made news.
He was called out all that stuff. He didn't push himself as much as you would have thought.
That was when he went to Marv Marinovich, right?
No, that was before.
He left the Marinovich.
Yeah. Oh, okay. It was before, actually.
Sorry, before, that's right.
He didn't push himself as much as I thought he would going into the GSP fight. Now, and I was very surprised, now you see who he's brought into Hilo. Tyron Woodley, Josh Thompson, Tarek Saffiedine, Jay Haran, Ben Askren. The way he looks, It's pretty amazing.
You see what the feeling of being obsolete will do to a guy.
Yeah.
You know, it's a guy who's a champion. He has that state of mind. He goes out and nobody's talking about him anymore. He mentioned that on that conference call. Now he's pretty hungry. You know, he's hungry again. Who knows how he'll show up? I think he'll show up in probably the best we've seen him.
Yeah, but one part of me wonders, is it too little too late? I remember before the Matt Hughes rematch, people were asking him, hey, BJ, how you training? He's like, I'm going to go for runs in the morning and surf. And there were pictures of him on InsideFighting.com surfing. That was how he was training. And of course, you know, he had the rib injury when he tried to go behind his back, but also he gassed pretty bad. You know,
awful.
There's no doubt he's going to come in shape in this fight. Absolutely. And BJ Penn was one of the first guys I ever was a fan of as a fan of the sport, because he was an amazing athlete. He was extremely technical, and he had a nice degree of savagery. He married all three like nobody else could. But getting in shape now, maybe he's going to go there and blow the doors off of Rory. I don't know. But I wonder if it's a little bit of desperation. I guess we just have to see.
What I love about BJ as far as the media is concerned, he is so sincere with his thoughts. When he talks to you, it feels like, you know, he often says your name. I don't know if you noticed this in an interview. He'll say, you know, Ariel, this and that. And even on the conference call, he said, Rory getting injured was the best thing to happen to me, because I was just going to come and do this fight and train a little bit, 40% body fat. Whether or not that's true, it doesn't really matter. Now he said, okay, he got injured. I ramped it up. And I realized this is my chance and the legacy and all that stuff. I just love his demeanor, Rory's demeanor, the heat there. I cannot wait for the stare down and everything leading up to that fight.
I do have somebody who told me that there might be, not a ton, just a little bit of disagreement among BJ Penn's coaches about him doing too much strength and conditioning. There's a belief that he might have gone, overboard might be a strong word, but disproportionate in the camp. I mean, I don't know
So
how
it's smoke and mirrors?
No, I don't think,
looks good.
no. He has done it all, and maybe a little more than he should have. I guess we'll have to see how he performs on
Well,
Friday.
that's a very big question, right? Because sometimes guys can peak too early. He wasn't injured. This fight was supposed to take place in September. So that's a very interesting thing. What did he do to sort of take his foot off the brake, especially when you have a guy who you don't necessarily want to see him take his foot off the brake, right?
You might be more worried about Rory MacDonald in that situation. Talking about UFC 145, he said he did that exact thing against Che Mills, that he overtrained, showed up, he felt way out of sorts.
But he beat the crap
yeah,
out
still
of
beat him
Che
up,
Mills,
but this
man.
isn't
Poor
Che
Che.
Mills this time. So it would
felt
go
bad
the other
for the
way as
kid.
well. You'd be looking at McDonald that way.
It's been 13 months since the UFC debuted on Fox. You know, they had their ups and downs, so to speak, with the cards. Are we in agreement, including UFC on Fox 6?
Absolutely.
This is,
Best
in my
show.
opinion, best main card of the year.
Best.
And we're a week out. Pray to the
Best.
MMA gods, everyone stays healthy. We just lost LeVar Johnson, which was a great fight.
I actually wish that they would put Rampage and Glover on this. I mean, that would have been the cream.
They don't need it.
They don't need it, but that would be so awesome if they did.
Even that fourth fight, Matt Brown and
But you
Mike
know what's
Swicks,
so
it's a
funny
great
though?
fight.
Nobody's even talking about Gustafsson. If Gustafsson wins, he's got a title shot. Nobody's
You
even
think-
talking about
You
that.
think he'll get it? I see him fighting maybe the winner
No, the
of
winner of-
Glover versus Rampage. Given the timing, he's
don't
not
think
going to
so.
sit out.
Yeah.
You know, if John Jones fights in April, he's not going to sit. It's December.
Yeah, you're right.
One note about that UFC and Fox card that I really like. I've been a big critic of how they've been putting those cards on. I remember I talked to John Orand of Sports Business Journal, and he was asking me, hey, who's going to be on that fourth fight for UFC on Fox, the fourth event? And it was initially Brian Stan, Hector Lombard. He's like, I have no idea who these people are. Right. That, to me, was a bad sign. Now, I don't think he knows who Ben Henderson, Nate Diaz is, but if I tell him it's for the UFC lightweight title, that is intriguing enough. You know, they missed that boat twice, if you recall. They missed it when they had Frankie Benson won in Japan, and then the rematch in Colorado. They could have, if you looked at the dates, they could have done that for those Fox shows. I was thinking to myself, these are the guys who need to be on Fox. Hats off to the people at Fox and the people at the UFC for putting the UFC lightweight title between two guys who if there's a guarantee for delivery, it is going to be those two guys, and that is absolutely the right decision.
And obviously,
Whoa, hold on. I said the same thing about Gray Maynard versus Clay Guida, and that fight was not good at all.
Well, I admit that's shocked us all, but Ben Henderson is just.
I would be shocked if that
I
fight
agree.
doesn't live up. And of course, I work for Fox. I should say that, but I think that what they have planned for next year, I like Fox 6. I like putting Demetrius Johnson and John Dodson on in the main event slot. I know our colleague Dave Meltzer wasn't a huge fan of that.
No, not at all.
I think it makes sense if you got guys like Rampage and whatnot on the undercard. I like the idea of putting a show Super Bowl weekend here in New
that'd be
York
so great.
in 2014. It just seems like they're starting to figure it out. And I'm very curious. I want to ask you this, Luke. I'm very curious about the rating because, as you know, Manny Pacquiao is fighting next weekend as well. Yeah. Fourth time against Juan Manuel Marquez. Personally, as a boxing fan solely, I'm not very interested in this fight. I don't like fourth fights, But obviously it's Manny, Marquez, huge fan bases. Once again, the UFC didn't do this on purpose, but will they be dwarfed by the boxing fight?
No, I don't think it has anything to do with it.
You don't think?
The first fight was on Fox. Look at that rating. It was the last Marquez Pacquiao fight, if I'm not mistaken.
You're right.
It's got nothing to, and also that Cinco de Mayo stuff is a total smokescreen.
How so?
Because it's true that they weren't able to use it properly and it worked to their disadvantage. But the counter argument to that is they don't really have a particularly strong Latino outreach. Latino boxers rule on pay-per-view on Cinco de Mayo, and they rule on TV when Cinco de Mayo. It's completely false that that's a notion that this
people
date
aren't watching
is always a
TV,
blackout
right?
date. That's not true. You just don't have the resources to take advantage of it.
Nate Diaz
That's the
versus
truth.
Jim Miller did not sell.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's not the right fight for Cinco de Mayo.
Right.
All I'm pointing out is it's got nothing
Cain
to do with it.
Velasquez could have fought.
Do you
Roger Huerta could have
think-
fought.
Exactly.
Do you think the idea that someone, because I feel like if I'm buying the pay-per-view and I'm a combat sports fan, I'm probably going to watch the undercard and everything because I want to get my money's worth, and it starts at around 9 or so, if I'm not mistaken. So do you think
boxing card.
The boxing.
Yeah.
That coincides with the UFC card.
Yeah.
Will someone
Also,
not?
it should be noted, it's a strong undercard. Yoriokas Gamboa is going to be
Right.
fighting on that
Yeah.
undercard.
So you want to get your money's worth.
It's actually the first strong undercard in like 2 years.
Yeah.
Because the UFC often says, and to his credit, Lorenzo Fertitta said afterwards it was a mistake to go up against it on Cinco de Mayo. I believe it was Floyd Mayweather fighting on that card.
the Victor Ortiz fight?
Something like that.
Yeah.
Anyhow, it was a big boxing.
Yeah.
But this is not the boxing beat. But the point is, I feel like
Thank God.
what they're saying initially was people are at home, they're having a party, they're going to watch us 8 to 10, and then they're going to go to the pay-per-view. I'm not sure if people do that. You know what I mean? I'm not sure if you have a crowd gathered at your house, you buy a $65 pay-per-view, you're going to watch it from beginning to end, in my opinion. Do you agree?
I agree.
All right.
I'm not so sure about that.
You don't think?
You're going to get your boxing diehards that do. I think it's almost like watching the audience fill in a venue. If you go to a boxing, MMA is getting some of that now, I suppose. But really, boxing, you go to Floyd Mayweather event, they'll have the maybe whoever is on the co-main, they'll be half full, and then by the time Floyd's walkout comes, the place is
Right.
completely.
You
I think the
bring up a
audience
really good
trickles in
point.
on pay-per-view the same way. Again, but we're also talking about two different audiences.
Yeah.
The overlap between boxing and MMA is very, very slight. So it's all about that casual middle space.
Right.
It's hard to say how much it really takes away. I don't think it's that
You
much.
bring up a really good point. You're at every fight, as I am, and I've noticed lately the undercards are empty. Like, remember 5 years ago, the undercards were filled, and I was always
Depending
like,
on the market, right?
Right.
Montreal.
but even in
pretty good
Vegas, though,
turnout.
they weren't.
Well,
they don't
Vegas
do it
is a bit of
anymore.
an interesting
But
one
they
these
used to
days.
be filled in the undercard. Now it's like nobody's there until the
Why do
main
you think
event
that
starts.
is?
I have no. Maybe
Listen.
maybe the tickets are more expensive, and the casual fans are coming now. I don't know.
Chuck, you were going to say something?
Well, in Vegas, it seems like, you're in Las Vegas, and a lot of times the fights are starting in the daytime. It seems like people aren't even aware that the fights are going to be going on that early. They just look at
But
the
my point is, they
main
used
card.
to be aware.
Right.
I mean, those undercards were always filled, and that was
lot
one
less
thing that I
cards,
always remarked.
bigger name fighters
That's true
on the
too.
undercard.
You're,
A lot
you're
has
right.
changed.
Yeah, a lot has changed.
It's almost apples and oranges at this
You're right.
point.
Less cards. I mean, that says
The
it
new
all.
UFC.
It is a new UFC, and UFC on Fox 5 is a huge one for them. A huge month for the UFC. 4 cards in the month of December as they close out 2012, an interesting year. And it is a year that we will look back on the next episode of the MMA Beat. For now, leave us your thoughts in the comments section below. We always love to hear about what you have to say, including the return of the one and only Mike Straka.
Please, just give me one positive comment, just once.
Once. You've never got one before.
Never.
Oh, he's got nice comments.
Never. Come on.
You look great, Straka. There's one.
Thanks.
There you go. So it's up to you. Leave Mike some
Coming from
positive
the guy
comments.
who stole my show.
That is a perfect way, at least someone brought it up, to end this episode of the MMA Beat. For Mike Straka, Luke Thomas, Chuck Mindenhall, I'm Ariel Helwani. Thank you so much for watching the MMA Beat right here on MMAfighting.com.